Thanks. And this is a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 2 days and the group assembled here. So it'd be nice to hear a little bit more in particular about your last reference, Mark, to obligations of, that states have towards civil society, and speak more about what we as communities who work on human rights and elections can do, and in particular recognizing that states have an obligation. How can groups who care about this challenge be more active, and what exactly are the strategies that can be pursued among the kinds of groups that are assembled here to address these challenges? So I guess in a way it's another round at the same question.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'd like to pick up that point because I do think that one of the things that we see is that the states that have wanted to push back on closing civic space have really learned from each other. And so there are some specific practices that are being used, and I don't think we've done as good a job on the other side of pulling together, why those practices do violate rights and how they violate obligations in a way that hurts states. And we haven't built the case with a sufficient number of allies. And I think this is the case even today when we speak, and we have an online audience now. When we talk about civil society and civic space, I don't think those are terms that necessarily translate to a broader audience. We need to start talking more about who these actors are and what they do in our societies that's relevant, and we need to break it down more in a way that makes it more visible to people. I like some of the points that our colleague made about people yearning for these rights and how she sees this activism in the Zimbabwean context. I think it's very important for us to speak in terms that aren't so legalistic at times. And I think we need to build new allies. One of the points that you'd raised earlier is about the role, for example, of business. Business has said, and the private sector knows, that they operate better in a space that is open for civil society, that they want a space where democracy is flourishing to be able to work effectively. But yet how they translate that into how they work and how they can be proponents for that open civic space is something that, for obvious reasons, business has sometimes had some trepidation over. But I think we can do more to bring them into the conversation, and we can do more. I think Mark is right that we've seen that there is also a good-sized group of people who want to be active on these issues, but I also don't think we've given them a strong enough platform for them to engage. So if we draw better on pushing governments on what their obligations are and making it clear to them that there are practices that are inconsistent with human rights and that can be improved, if we draw on business as an ally in this effort, and if we give the public and people more of an opportunity to voice their concerns effectively and to be part of the struggle, I think we'll have a good platform upon which we can push back this trend.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to you, Peggy? I think your comment about needing to get less technical and legalistic in this conversation is a good one. And as somebody who's from the UN office in Geneva, and we're talking about obligations, can you, in simple layman's terms, say a bit about what these obligations are?
What we're really talking about, some of the core rights here, are freedom of association and assembly, and freedom of expression, and the right to participate in your own government, in the decisions that matter to your well-being and your future. And what we need to be able to convey to people is that basic understanding of what the state's obligation is to them and what their role is in a functioning society is what's at stake here when we talk about the civic space or civil society, and people's ability to have their voices heard on the decisions that matter most to them, and that the only effective way for that to happen is not by each individual being able to do that, but that coming together to have those voices heard is what we mean when we talk about civil society or civic space.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Rindai to maybe say a few words about the current context in Zimbabwe, where I know everyone's aware of the dramatic change in the political circumstances and uncertainty about the way forward, and elections, presumably soon on the horizon, and what these challenges mean in the current context of Zimbabwe. So Rendai, maybe you could speak a little bit about that. And then Mark, I'd invite you to comment on both globally and Zimbabwe, these issues again.
Thank you very much. In terms of the recent developments in Zimbabwe, well, some people call it a military coup, some call it a political coup, whatever it is. The recent transfer of power in Zimbabwe offers an opportunity for us, civil society, to advocate and increase calls for electoral and political reforms before we go to the new elections. So we believe that this new era is widely expected to usher in new dispensation, and we're scheduled to have elections in July, August next year. But we believe that there isn't much time to allow for significant reforms which are necessary before we go to the next elections. There are 5 key asks which we have put in place as civil society in Zimbabwe before we go to the next election. The first one is the need for a new electoral law which needs to be aligned to the 2013 constitution. And mainly electoral laws to do with improving the conducive environment, fundamental freedoms of association and assembly. That is very important. And also to demilitarize the state institutions like the Electoral Commission. There is a militarization which we saw in the past elections, and with the recent role of the military, we believe they do have an upper hand in the next elections. So there is need also to make sure that there are some security sector reforms to ensure that we remove the military role in the next elections. More importantly, is also the independence of the Electoral Commission. It needs to be adequately resourced, to be truly independent, and also to make sure that we remove the executive interference. Right now, there is a process of biometric voter registration which is ongoing. That process is still not complete. We expect a new voters' roll. In 2013 elections, the voters' roll was manipulated, and it affected the credibility of the elections. So we believe that going forward, it's one of the requests which we do have as civil society, that we do have a clean, accurate, and up-to-date voter register. And lastly, we think that elections also to be credible, we need a wide range of observers from the region, the international community, and the national observers, starting now, since the voter registration, which is one of the key electoral processes ongoing, there is need already for observers to begin coming to Zimbabwe, and also organizations working on electoral dispute resolution and conflict management. As you know, that we've been polarized for so many years, since 2000, so there is need also for that approach in terms of electoral dispute resolution mechanisms which work to the satisfaction of all key stakeholders, and also conflict mechanisms, so that at least the next elections are held in a peaceful and conducive environment.
Rendai, before we go to Mark, can I ask a quick follow-up? And that's about the degree to which it will be possible for the international community to play a constructive role in Zimbabwe. We know that in the last 10, 20 years, even in Zimbabwe, it's been more difficult, and we obviously as international community need to respect host country sovereignty, and the ability for us to engage constructively is strongly affected by the degree to which there's openness for our involvement. And while we can try in many ways to be helpful and constructive, we have a much greater chance to do that if there's openness on the part of the host country government. What is your sense of how that issue is likely to evolve in the next 6 months or a year?
The maiden speech of the new president, he made indications that they are open to restore international relations with the international community. And as such, we took it like they are inviting the international community, to the regional community, to re-engage with Zimbabwe in order to restore the relations. And likewise, it means it is extended organizations like the Carter Center, the National Democratic Institute, the IFES of this world, the Commonwealth, to re-engage Zimbabwe right now with a view of coming to observe the elections. And I think if you look at what happened in Kenya, it calls for long-term presence of observers. So that's why we're saying this work begins now. we need also to re-engage this new government now and put clearly these demands that were interested to come and observe the elections, and also to assist where possible, technical assistance in areas which I've listed, in terms of the voter register, in terms of results management, so that there is open and transparent electoral processes. In my view, it's pointless for us to wait till it's late. And also it's pointless to have those elections if they're not going to usher in a credible election, lest we find ourselves back to square one, to the past era. So we hope that this new dispensation would lead us to a clean plate, which is going to be ushered in through a fresh and credible elections.
Thank you, Rindai. Mark, your thoughts on all of these issues?
Well, thank you. So first of all, what can we do to have states respect, protect and promote civil society space and freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of expression? I would say two things on that. Firstly, not all states are the same. All states are equal, but some are more equal than others. What do I mean by that is oftentimes at the UN, the Human Rights Council, we tend to see all states as the same. And we tend to focus on certain states which are routinely violating human rights. A lot of our attention is there. I mean, in fact, in my experience, the vast majority of states in the UN family are actually trying to improve the human rights situation and are trying to do their best to promote and protect human rights. So here I'm mainly talking about those countries where there is, as Peggy was talking about, a concerted effort to restrict civil society space, including in the context of elections, rather than what I think is the majority of countries which do have good intention and do have the political will to improve things. So what can we do with these states? Well, I think we've talked about it. The international obligations on human rights are incredible, and that's why we're talking about human rights and elections here. They're incredibly powerful. States have negotiated these international norms and then have voluntarily signed and ratified the treaties, which means that can be used as leverage to get states to promote, protect and respect human rights. However, unfortunately, at the UN level, we've not been very good at doing that, holding states accountable against their international obligations. Why? Because how do you do that? You do that through transparency and public accountability. And states, especially states with things to hide, have, of course, gone out of their way to avoid that kind of international scrutiny. A few examples, some of which we've talked about over the past 2 days. One is the Universal Periodic Review mechanism, which is supposed to hold states accountable against their international obligations. Certain states have gone out of their way to avoid that civil society and national human rights institutions can participate actively in the Universal Periodic Review interactive dialogue with states under review. Why? Because they don't want that reality check to come from the ground to say what the states are actually doing. So then it becomes a kind of beauty contest where states are saying, we've done this, yes, we're complying with our international obligations, safe in the knowledge that there won't be a dissenting voice in the room. Another example, Peggy touched on it, is reprisals against civil society NGOs who seek to cooperate and provide information to the UN system. And again, certain states, not all states, but certain states have gone out of their way to intimidate, attack physically and otherwise these individuals because they don't want that kind of level of scrutiny and public accountability. So that means that if they don't want that spotlight on them, our response should be to make sure that we sharpen and strengthen that spotlight on these states at international level, especially. In terms of Zimbabwe, I won't go into, I think you covered nearly everything, but I would use Zimbabwe as a good example of what I just said, that we need to use the leverage of the international community of states' international obligations to basically backstop and support the kind of reforms that everybody knows Zimbabwe needs. So that means encouraging the current government to use this period now of transition to sign and ratify all the international treaties, as you were suggesting, to re-engage with the international community, to get the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, different relevant parts of the UN, like UNDP, the Commonwealth, to be there. knowing that by having that international spotlight and international pressure, it will make it much more difficult for the government to backslide on some of the reforms that they've promised. It's not the answer in of itself, but I think it can really help backstop and strengthen the reforms.
I'd like to ask two more questions to the panel before we go to the audience here and perhaps online. The first is maybe drilling down a little bit on what we've been talking about already and focusing on contexts where there's divided civil society. We've been talking about the challenges to having civil society participate in democracy in a context of global challenges and shrinking space. But in many country contexts, the situation might even be worse because of politicization among civil society groups, civil society divided amongst itself, and maybe the extra challenges that might pose in those contexts. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts about that particular kind of context. And again, I guess we just go across the panel left to right and start with Peggy.
Thanks. Well, this issue arises in a lot of different ways. In the elections context, of course, you know, we are looking at, and we sometimes have conversations about how do we treat political parties? How do we look at different groupings within society that may be closely aligned with a political perspective, and how does that affect our conversation about civic space? I mean, I think ultimately that is where some of the standards that we have are the most useful. The more politicized the context, the more we have to go back to some of the basic rights and what matters, and have to have respect for dissent, respect for other people's space, and ultimately, if those standards are being enforced fairly and there's transparency about how it's being done, then I think, you know, there can be mutual respect, and it can be a calming influence rather than one that allows for that politicization to move forward. But I have to say, in the UN context, one of our big issues is about so-called gongos, the idea that we protect so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, but governments are creating civil society groups that are basically wholly captured by the government themselves and are therefore using up the space that's supposed to be meant for the public voice and for civic engagement, and they are sort of infiltrating that and using up the space and time in ways that eliminates real discourse and real room for dissent. And so I do think there are some difficult questions that need to be addressed about how we define civic space and how we make sure that that when we're talking about freedom of association and the ability of people's voices to be heard, that there is a way to ensure that the space isn't usurped by the most powerful actors, which are generally those associated with government in one way or another.
Working in civil society over 20 years now, I noted that civil society is a group which is diverse. It's not a homogeneous entity, and there are different interests and the stakes at play. Some of the groups are pro-government, and some of them are pro-opposition. Then we do have the third category of those who are in the middle of the road, neither pro-opposition nor ruling party. But the most important aspect, I think, is to make sure that civil society works together and they share common vision, common values, and also principles. If you look for us working in the field of democracy and promoting democratic elections, the key principles are non-partisanship, professionalism, and inclusivity. And we feel that these must be upheld, because compromising these also undermines the role of civics. And also it poses a threat in societies which are repressive. Once you are taking sides with the ruling or opposition party, you find that most civic society defenders, human rights defenders, they are being targeted, and also they become victims of attack. So I think it is important that there is room for coordinated and collaborative effort among civic society organizations to contribute towards the democratization and also working together. In our case, we realized that towards election time, there is a lot of divisions, open competition. So we created clusters and invite civics across different diverse groups. Those who interested in election observation, those interested in voter and civic education, and some are interested in research and advocacy, and also some just media and information dissemination, so that you embrace everyone and also involve them in one way or the other. We realized that also with the donor fatigue and also reduced donor funding, it creates lots of these divisions. So it is important that everyone get involved, everyone also take part in terms of engaging and also mobilization of the citizens. And I think so going forward, it is important that we embrace an all-inclusive approach to make sure that there is proper coordination and that every civil society also is getting involved one way or the other in terms of different activities, looking at the whole electoral cycle.
And Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with those who have said on one level it doesn't matter that civil society actors have different opinions and different views, including political views. What's key is that their space to be able to function and express those views is protected. Clearly there are limits to that statement, such as where NGOs or civil society themselves are going against human rights or against the rights of others. And one example that we're seeing a lot of that at the moment is civil society or the media is promoting hate speech or incitement against certain groups. That, of course, raises issues of permissible limitations on freedom of expression and the different views on that in the US and Europe and elsewhere. But I think that's an important point to bear in mind, that NGOs and civil society also have responsibilities. I also agreed with Peggy on the issue of gongos. This is something we're seeing a lot in Geneva, where governments, as well as restricting civil society space for legitimate NGOs, are also creating or backing their own NGOs to basically praise the government. And this goes back to what I was saying, that governments are extremely sensitive to international pressure, international scrutiny, transparency about whether they are complying with their international human rights obligations. If they weren't, they wouldn't create these gongos. If they weren't, they wouldn't try to prevent legitimate NGOs from participating in debates in Geneva. But it's also very difficult to deal with, because if you start limiting at the UN, for example, the participation or creating criteria for which NGOs can participate and which can't, then it's really a slippery slope. So here I think the byword should really be to, again, just protect that space, accept that there will be different NGOs that may have more or less legitimacy, but they should still be able to speak, but safe in the knowledge that their views will probably be drowned out by the majority of NGOs that would take a more critical line to the government that's backing that Congo.
Final question to the panel before we open it up to the rest of our audience. I'd like to raise the issue that I think has been alluded to in some ways, the new threats that are present related to the larger presence we face of the internet, social media, and information around politics, elections, and human rights. In many ways, it's been a democratizing development, in that the means for more people to participate and be active in the political space is clearly there, but the flip side is growing threats, I think, in many ways to civil society and to genuine participation. So I'd like to ask the panelists their thoughts about the nature of the current environment and what we face looking forward, and how to think about the role of the internet and social media and mass media or social media information challenges in this space.
Thanks, David, and I'm really glad you're asking about that, because I do think it raises this discussion to an entirely different level and needs to be really brought in. Our office is looking very much at human rights in the digital space as one of the key areas where our work as a leader in the human rights community has to evolve and change, both to take advantage of the opportunities posed by technology, but also to be at the forefront of responding to the threats to human rights that are brought about in the digital world in a variety of ways. In the elections environment, we've seen, obviously, that we don't even fully understand how the threats evolve and how they've been used. So there is an enormous amount of concern. I would emphasize that my sense is that the basic questions are more of understanding those threats and applying the existing standards and approaches to dealing with them than it is that we have to create, all new standards and all new ways of working. I think there's a natural tendency to sort of feel like we don't have the tools, but I think the tools are there. We just need to be willing to adapt and evolve them and apply them under different circumstances. But the key questions, of course, are also relate to the status of the big tech industry and how it can regulate itself and to what extent that those responsibilities need to be done by government. And the key questions that Mark alluded to as well about where do we draw the lines in terms of how these platforms are used for incitement, for hate speech, all of which I believe that the human rights framework is going to be fundamental to help us answer those questions. So we're more relevant today than ever, but we just need to find a way to make sure that that voice is heard as part of these discussions, which are actually very urgent and need to happen in a fast-paced world that the challenges are evolving while we're waiting to figure out the answers for last week's challenges. New ones are emerging as we speak. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think the point about the key is understanding the nature of these challenges, and really, that's the first step before we can really know how to proceed. Rindai, your thoughts on this, and then Mark, and then we'll move to a wider participation.
Okay. When I look back in terms of the impact of social media in Zimbabwe, it has been increasing over the past years. Now we do have over 95% penetration of people using internet in Zimbabwe. The most popular mediums are WhatsApp, the Twitter, and Facebook. In 2016, we realized that a number of social movements emerged, predominantly using social media to mobilize people across different diversity groups. We do have movements such as this flag, Dajamuka, which were highly visible on social media and recorded significant success in organizing and mobilizing the masses. And the recent events which happened last week in Zimbabwe, I think globally it was easy to see these events through social media. And the mobilization, I remember the march which took place on the Saturday of the 18th, it happened just a few hours in the evening. Through social media, it was easy to mobilize across the different sectors and all different classes. People came out. But so in terms of pushing for socio-economic and political reforms, it is also working, and it is worked for us in terms of Zimbabwe, where it was difficult to gather people where there is the Public Order and Security Act. But moving information, exchanging information through social media was easier to share information, updates, current developments. So it is a very useful aspect. But in return, what we've seen is that there is the introduction of interception laws. Recently, there is a cyberspace bill, which is also underway. So we see that there is also self-censorship in terms of what people now post on the social media. There is also less it violates the freedom of expression. So we see most people now who are more courageous posting sometimes very critical aspects before the recent events were those in the diaspora. When you're in Zimbabwe, you just censor yourself. There is a recent case of an American citizen called Martha. She was arrested for retweeting a tweet on it was on President Mugabe that he was a goblin. She just retweeted what was there, but she was arrested for that issue. So that kind of instilled fear among the citizens. and it affects some of those fundamental freedoms. But of course, the new era which we experienced, we don't know really what is going to happen. But the laws, as I mentioned, they're coming, which means that there is going to be clampdown in terms of enjoyment of the fundamental freedoms. But the other side also, which we've seen, is the issue of fake news and the misinformation. And towards election time, I saw it even in Kenya and a number of African countries where the elections, sometimes there is a lot of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, to the extent that you can't even differentiate what is genuine and what is fake news. So those are some of the side effects of it, that while we enjoy and also get information, current news, but also there is also the issue of fake news, which I think needs to also to be looked into in terms of how that should be regulated, particularly in the field of elections. It can also be very dangerous when we do have fake news. But by the end of the day, I think it's a good tool in terms of information dissemination. And also, it is here to stay, social media. I think we need to exploit, particularly those of us working in civil society, but the extent to which we can also mitigate some of the negative effects is what needs to be looked into and also to be established.
And Mark, final thoughts before we open this up to a broader audience.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah, I agree that new technology and social media is a big opportunity for human rights and potentially is a great facilitator of existing human rights. So the human rights don't change themselves, but this gives a whole new medium through which to promote and protect and further those human rights. And that includes in the context of elections. If we look at elections in terms of mobilizing or enthusing the population around an election, around participation in public affairs, then the social media clearly has huge potential. If we're looking at awareness raising, voter education, again, huge potential, but clearly there are many challenges associated with this as well. We've already talked about some of them, such as politicians or journalists or social media commentators using the internet, using social media to promote hate speech, especially again in the context of elections, because of course certain politicians would see it as a vote winner to attack certain minority groups within a country, and so it can create, as we know, in many cases, very difficult issues and big problems. Another thing I've seen in elections recently, which is interesting in the context of elections, is also the use of social media, for example, for different candidates or different groups supporting different candidates, to start publishing different results from the election, which is, again, raises very interesting and difficult and sensitive issues, because on the one hand, one could say it's promoting transparency and involvement in elections. On the other hand, clearly it's also creating confusion, links to fake news. It can create divisions in society, so difficult issues, but much more to talk about.
Thanks to the panelists. We have still a good amount of time for people in the room or online, so I welcome questions from folks here, and please raise your flag and maybe identify yourself if you don't mind, and we'll start with Ed McMahon.
Thank you. My name's Edward McMahon. I'm University of Vermont and UPR Info, NGO in Geneva that works on the Universal Periodic Review. My question is two-part. To Rindai, be very interested to get your thoughts about the fact that coups traditionally have been tanks rolling in the streets, taking over the television station, shutting down the parliament, arresting the president, and suspending the Constitution. Most of those things did not happen in Zimbabwe. And my question for you is, to what extent did they not happen because of internal political dynamics, including the historical figure of the President Mugabe? And to what extent did it not happen because of sub-regional, regional, and UN perhaps level legal and doctrinal pressures not to stage a coup? And I think my broader question to the whole panel here is regarding that second part of the question. To what extent do you think that international norms and a legal environment can impede retrogression in terms of democracy?
Rindai, would you like to respond first?
The question is still subject to different interpretations and analysis. And I'm sure the academia is going to assist us to find answers to these questions. But I think what is more inevitable is that Zimbabwe was ripe for change either way or the other. It was 37 of the Robert Mugabe rule, and people were fed up. So there was collusion of common interests from the military, civil society, the opposition, everyone, and even the international community. I think everyone also wanted that particular change. It happened, however, unexpectedly, and the way it happened, that it was bloodless. It is not easy to describe how it was done, but I think the main reasons was for legitimacy, that the current regime wanted legitimacy more than anything else. So that's why I think it didn't happen the usual coup we know, which are usually taking longer. Once coup starts, sometimes it leads to civil wars. It will be difficult to stop those civil wars. And I don't think from the military side and all Zimbabweans wouldn't want such a situation. So the new regime wanted to get legitimacy, and I think basically that was the only way to do it. SADC was waiting to intervene. If you look, the African Union under the African Charter also, they are against coups. So they were also going to be ready to intervene. And if the borders for Zimbabwe were closed by the neighboring countries, so it was very difficult also even for the military regime to survive and for the Zimbabweans also to operate in a sustainable manner. So those were some of the fears, I think, and it explains how it happened. It was basically also to get the legitimacy so that we move on and life goes on as usual. And in any case, there is a Congress mid-December for ZANU-PF. So the new government, the new president is going to get the mandate and the legitimacy from the ruling party. And we do have also elections, as I mentioned before, scheduled for July, between July and August next year, in less than a year. So definitely the reason I think why they are going for an earlier election is also to get that legitimacy, so that there is recognition of the new government by the international and the regional community. If it was a coup the way we know it, I don't think there was going to be much interest and also recognition by the international and the regional community. It was going to take so long for Zimbabwe to recover from a period of 37 rule under Robert Mugabe, and then also the impact of the coup, it was going to worsen the situation than ever.
Peggy or Mark, would you like to respond?
Just to pick up one piece of that, not with any of the expertise that Rindai brings on the Zimbabwe point, but it gives me a chance to say something about the regional level, which I think is really important here. I do think that, of course, we look at these issues as being universal in the universal rights framework that we use, but there is, I think, a very important relevance, as came through in Rindai's statement, about how situations and approaches to them have evolved at the regional level, and I do think that coup is not as easy a word to hear and to use as it might have been earlier, and I would take that same understanding potentially to a situation on civic space that I got a chance to view recently myself, which is in Hungary, where we've seen a real diminution in civic space and real concerns on a variety of fronts about the way the new NGO law and other factors have really moved civil society groups there to feel like they're under attack. And one of the things I kept hearing from people there is about the role of the EU and what was expected from the European partners in that context. And of course, there are all sorts of mechanisms at the European level that can be brought in, and of course, European funding that can be implicated based on how the situation in Hungary develops. So I think we often talk at the international and at the local level, but that regional level provides both some of the context and the most important levers, I think, for influencing change on some of these issues.
Mark, some comments on that?
Yeah, regarding the last part of the question, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind after watching the UN human rights system for 11 years that the international normative framework does guide and promote progress, so progression. The more difficult question then, which you posed, is does it stop regression? And there I think the jury is out, but it's not out because of any faults with the international normative framework for human rights. I think it's in question because I'm not convinced we have strong enough international mechanisms on compliance to hold states accountable against their international obligations and call them out when they're not doing that. So I think that, which again ties into what I said before about improving transparency and public accountability at international level about what states are doing at domestic level. And that really does matter, because if there's one thing that I've seen that states do care about in terms of whether they're making progress or regression on human rights, it's the views and the perspectives and their reputation before their peers, other states, especially, as we heard, if they're from the same region. In this case, we're talking about Zimbabwe, the African region. States do not like to have a public spotlight put on them for doing committing human rights violations. They don't like to be embarrassed. They don't like to be reminded that they're violating their international obligations. And so this is something that we need to leverage much more.
We have time for a few more questions. I think Hillary Gebedema is next. If you could introduce yourself and your question, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Hillary Gebedema, and I'm a member of the CEDAW committee. My question is to Peggy Hicks. I tended to agree with you when you made the comment about understanding the new threats that social media poses and applying the existing standards to them. But I have noticed that there are some threats that are posed by social media which do not fall into the classic definitions of the existing norms. Let me give a couple of examples. For example, we know about the secrecy of the vote, and that your vote must be secret. But increasingly, we are seeing a new phenomenon by which voters are being required to photograph their voting and report to whoever, whether a spouse or a party person. We are seeing the publication of different results, as Mark Lemon alluded to. So what does it fall under? We are seeing the violation also of the prohibition of campaigning 48 hours before the election starts. Typically, we understood what a campaign was. You go out and you are seen. Now it is being done electronically. So how do we strike this balance about the ability to use existing methods or the imperative of formulating new standards to deal with this threat? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hillary, and very good points about some of the new challenges that we face. I'm sure there are others in the group here that have much more background in terms of the electoral issues that you've raised. My sense is, and I think we get into a sort of a semantic debate about whether we need new standards or new approaches or new guidance, I agree wholeheartedly that we need to look at how we use the existing standards and approaches to take on these new challenges that you've put on the table, and that may require us to think differently about some of the existing guidance that we have under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example, and we need to be willing to extrapolate and move on. But we've had to do that in the past as well. I mean, the reality is that sort of evolution of the means by which human rights abuse can occur has happened, and we see it, of course, in the debate over the technological advances on weapons of war as well, where a similar debate happens about whether or not the Geneva Conventions are up to speed with the current challenges. And again, I think that we can spend a lot of time talking about where there might be gaps. I think most of that time would be better spent really taking what we have and applying it strongly and effectively to the new challenges that are developing.
Thank you. I think there's a few more questions, and so I'd like the questioners to be brief to the extent possible. I think, Jan, you were next. Jan Kamenek, if you could identify yourself and pose your question, and then we'll go to Maria Soledad, and I believe there's an online question.
All right. My name is Jan Kamenek. I'm working for the Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Czech Republic. Peggy, you raised the issue of Gongos. So-called non-governmental organizations created by the government to defend the government. What about Gongos among the domestic election observation organization? Do they exist? Because the domestic election observation organization, they are NGOs as well. The second question, it's a general question. We discussed here yesterday and today the restrictions of the civil society space. Well, you have a usual suspects list, but there are more countries being added to the list, including from my home region. What should be the reaction of the international community to these so-called newcomers? Should it be the same or should it be a different reaction? Thank you.
Quickly, I want to make sure we have time for all the questions. On the second part, on the newcomers, I think it goes to Mark's point about regression. I mean, for me, I think we need to react very strongly when states go back, right? And that is the moment where the quick action and quick engagement is most important. We have to signal that those types of retrograde steps are seen and not accepted. And I do think that that there is a need for a heightened engagement in those situations. In terms of the domestic election observers, I think I'd have to turn to my colleagues here to say that, of course, I think you pose a perfectly clear question about how election observation can itself be captured in a way as well. So certainly that phenomenon can exist. And then the question, as Mark said with Gongos, is how do you control for that without eliminating the space that one needs to have domestic election observation be done in the right way and in a unbiased and nonpartisan way, as Rendai said.
We are almost out of time. I don't know. This is a question maybe to our organizers. Can we go over a minute or two or no? We can. Okay. So I'd like to then give the floor to Maria Soledad for her question. If you can identify yourself, and we'll take your question.
Thank you. We cannot forget the relationship between civil society and the courts, because in the case of violation of the right of vote, in a local level through the presentation of legal actions, and in relation to treaty bodies through the presentations of individual complaint. And in the case of my country, for example, with the presentation of a case, it pushed the research, then the lobby in the parliament, and finally the legislation that give facilities and support for persons with disability in the exercise of the right of vote. I would like to know, perhaps Peggy or Mike knows about the statistics or studies about the role of civil society in the presentation of legal actions and individual complaint. Thank you.
Peggy or Mark, which one of you is best placed to?
Do you mean individual complaints as in the procedures at international level? Well, it's a very timely question because the Universal Rights Group is just about to publish a big report on the United Nations individual complaints procedures. I don't have exact statistics here with me, but I would say that it's an incredibly underused process. That's mainly because many civil society actors around the world don't seem to even know they have the possibility of submitting individual petitions to the special procedures, to the treaty bodies, or to the council itself. It's also, even those individuals that do present or submit individual petitions, quite frankly, they can't have a very high expectation that they will get much in the way of a response. Mainly because of a lack of resources at the UN level. So there's a lot of work to do there because potentially these procedures are incredibly effective. It's the only direct link between individual victims and members of civil society with the international human rights protection system. These procedures go back to the very foundation of the UN. In fact, why did the UN build the human rights protection system? It did so because individual victims after the Second World War were sending in so many petitions demanding international support to address the violations they were suffering that Eleanor Roosevelt and the rest in the end felt compelled to start building this international human rights protection system. I'm not talking about the promotion system, I'm talking about some of the protection mechanisms. So incredibly important, underused, and perhaps undervalued, and we need to address that because it is actually incredibly important.
Thanks. We'll take the online question to close out the session. Avery, could you relay that question to us?
Yes, thank you. Christopher Davis asks, what about referenda, which purport to be the direct voice of the people? I am thinking of this in the context of the recent vote on the EU here in the UK. What would the views of the panel be about the role of civil society in these?
Interested respondents? Mark, please. Okay.
As I'm British, I guess I should answer that. Yeah, well, I think it's a very interesting question because the issue with referenda, especially in a place like the UK where they don't have a political tradition of referenda, so it would be different in Switzerland, for example, where they seem to have them every day. But in the UK, it's not a normal way of working. And the thing with referenda is it boils very complex, difficult, sensitive, emotive questions down to a single binary response, yes or no. And that was seen perfectly in the case of the UK's Brexit referendum. And what does that mean? It means that some of the groups I've mentioned earlier in terms of civil society groups, political groups, NGOs who've got funding perhaps from suspect sources, are able to use that simple yes-no response to very complex questions, basically to manipulate the electorate and to create certain fears of foreigners, for example, of people who are different, of the other, so playing on some of the worst instincts of human beings to help shape the debate and to help create the conditions that led to, in my opinion, although I know not everybody in the UK would agree with this, that led to the decision to leave. So I think it's probably the UK referendum amplified a lot of the problems that we've been talking about here.
Yeah, just I really like Mark's answer to that question, and to say it's something that we grapple with, that the support for the population and for people to have a voice is not always best effectuated through a referendum. And in fact, of course, what we've seen is that referenda can be misused, and the populism can lead to results that are majoritarianism in a way that will very negatively affect basic human rights for people. So I think it's a really important question. I'm glad it was asked by our audience, and I think that we have to really grapple with some of the issues that Mark's talking about, both having space for that type of engagement, but also making sure that it doesn't force decision making that needs to have multiple voices into the type of binary choice that can lead to bad policy decisions that leave large groups of people disenfranchised in various ways.
Thanks. So I'd like to thank our online audience, including the question from Christopher Davis, and the thanks to the panelists, Peggy Hicks, Rendai Baba, and Mark Lyman. We're concluding this session. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you at the next session. So Avery, I don't know if I don't think I need